expect to be able to make a good deal with him, and I want him to make a good deal for China.
Imagine that the world's two largest economies, the US and China, are engaged in a trade war. It all starts with one country imposing high tariffs on goods to force the other into negotiations. But what happens when this economic conflict reaches a new level? China imposes retaliatory tariffs, and their effects begin to devastate the US economy. If you thought that trade wars were limited to diplomatic statements, think again. This conflict has already turned many sectors of the economy upside down. Stock markets are fluctuating, manufacturers are facing higher costs, and consumers are starting to pay more for goods that previously seemed affordable. And this is just the beginning.
And Trump and his team prepare for their brutal swing through Asia. In a meeting with President Xi, China's decided to try to up the ante by bullying companies.
How did the US, traditionally considered the economic leader, end up in this situation? The answer lies in the fact that the global economy has long ceased to be a two-sided game. China, which has been building its economic power over the past decades, is now not only responding to the actions of the US, but also preparing a response that could lead to a real economic crisis. After all, if the war of goods and tariffs continues, it could lead to global upheavals that will change the balance of power on the world stage. But how exactly are China's countermeasures beginning to destroy the US economy? First of all, we are talking about price increases for thousands of goods imported into the US. These goods range from consumer electronics to industrial equipment. Manufacturers who depend on cheap Chinese components are faced with a choice: either raise prices or cut production. In both cases, American consumers suffer. They face rising prices for products that were previously affordable. But that's just the tip of the iceberg.
Planning on doing big investments in the United States. Trump's trade rep, who's headed to Asia tomorrow, responded this way. Attempts at intimidation will not stop the United States from rebuilding its shipbuilding base and responding appropriately to China's targeting of critical industrial sectors for dominance.
Every new tariff, every new restriction threatens jobs, especially in industries such as agriculture and high technology. What will happen to farmers who cannot sell their products to China? How will sanctions blocking access to key Chinese markets affect American companies? The answers to these questions are not yet clear, but one thing is obvious: the economic consequences are already being felt across the country. What steps is the US government taking to address these challenges? What decisions will help balance the economy? We will try to find answers to these questions in this video. We will look at what has been happening against the backdrop of the trade war, how China and the US are maneuvering, and what the world can expect if the escalation continues. Stay with us to find out how this will affect your life and the economy as a whole. Relations between the US and China have always been complex and multi-layered, but since the end of the Cold War, they have become the most important economic and political game on the world stage. These two countries are not just competing, they are setting the tone for the entire global market. Their economic interaction affects billions of people and trillions of dollars. The confrontation between the US and China is not just a struggle for control of markets, but also for global influence that goes far beyond trade.
But it's got to be fair. For years, they were making $500, $600, $700 billion. $700 billion, and we'd be making nothing. It was a one-sided, honestly, we built their military. We built China's military with the money that we lost for so many years.
At the beginning of the 21st century, China rapidly became an economic giant capable of undermining traditional world foundations. In just a few decades, China managed to transform its economy from a poorly developed one into the world's factory. The transition from socialist planning to a market economy in the 1980s provided China with phenomenal growth, which inevitably caused concern in the US. By the mid-2000s, China had become the world's largest manufacturer of goods, as well as the most important creditor to the US. This created a strange and tense symbiotic relationship. China needed the US as the main market for its goods, and the US needed China as a source of cheap goods and financing for its deficit. However, by 2010, the economic interests of the two countries began to openly conflict. The US began to accuse China of manipulating its currency, which made Chinese goods artificially cheap and created enormous trade inequality. China, in turn, felt aggrieved because its industrial capacity was developing, but the US continued to use its trade power to dominate international markets. These contradictions led to an open economic confrontation that began to take the form of a trade war.
Specifically, under the new U.S. approach, countries must now buy access to the world's largest economy through a combination of tariffs, investments, unilateral trade liberalization, and policy changes in their home markets.
The first serious wave of trade sanctions began in 2018, when the US, led by Donald Trump, announced the introduction of a 25% tariff on Chinese goods worth about $50 billion. In response, China immediately introduced its own measures, imposing tariffs on American goods, including agricultural products and automobiles. Since then, tensions between the two countries have continued to grow, and negotiations on trade terms have not yielded any real results. The economic conflict, which began as a dispute over trade practices, quickly escalated into a full-fledged struggle for economic supremacy. What was behind this escalation? First and foremost, the growing fear in the US that China could not only catch up with, but also overtake America in the ranks of the world's leading economies. In response to its declining share of the global market, the US began to pursue an increasingly aggressive policy. As China continued to build its power by developing high technology, infrastructure, and global trade links, the US felt its position as a world power was threatened. Problems in the US economy, such as the budget deficit and domestic production issues, also became important factors that fueled growing discontent.
This new US trade policy has several motivations: to raise tariff revenues, to protect strategic industries, to encourage foreign investment in the United States, and to change trade and non-trade policy in US partners.
Since 2018, when the actual trade war began, economic clashes between China and the US have had serious consequences. The US began to raise tariffs on Chinese goods, which, on the one hand, put pressure on China, but on the other hand, also affected American consumers. Each tariff increase was not only a blow to the Chinese economy, but also a pain for Americans themselves as prices for everyday goods began to rise. Dairy products, electronics, clothing, cars, all these goods became more expensive, which in turn caused inflation to rise and negatively affected the purchasing power of the population. In addition, entrepreneurs and manufacturers in the US faced the problem of rising production costs. Many companies that previously purchased cheap Chinese components were now forced to look for alternatives, which led to higher production costs. Businessmen began to demand action from the government, as the tariff increases threatened their profits, and against the backdrop of uncertainty in trade negotiations, the market found itself in a precarious position.
Those trade deals with other countries also have limited or no relief from those sectoral tariffs in those strategic industries such as steel and autos. They include substantial commitments by the U.S. trade partners for investments in the United States and significant unilateral trade liberalization measures.
It was at this moment that China entered the scene, not only responding to U.S. sanctions, but also taking a step that could seriously disrupt U.S. economic stability. China imposed retaliatory tariffs that affected a wide range of goods, including key components for American high-tech companies, such as semiconductors, microelectronics, and even rare earth metals. The situation was exacerbated by the fact that China also began to reduce its purchases of U.S. debt bonds. This financial manipulation caused the value of U.S. bonds to fall, which increased their yield and thus began to threaten the stability of financial markets. However, the consequences were only just beginning. China's retaliatory measures hit American farmers hard. While the U.S. continued to accuse China of violating trade rules, the Chinese authorities focused on protecting their agricultural sector, which was under pressure from U.S. tariffs. China decided to reduce imports of soybeans, wheat, and other products from the U.S., which dealt a blow to U.S. agriculture. Thousands of American farmers found themselves on the verge of bankruptcy, as the Chinese market was one of the largest buyers of their products. This move by China not only affected American farmers, but also the entire economy, as agriculture has always played a key role in the country's economic stability.
Well, you know, when U.S. officials talk, we need to make sure that we listen.
I spoke to Governor Trudeau on numerous occasions, and we'll see what happens. But it just sets up so good for them. Look, the people would pay much less tax than they're paying right now. They'd have perfect military protection.
The U.S. economy began to feel the painful consequences of trade sanctions and tariffs. Industrial enterprises began to cut back on production, while consumers faced rising prices for goods. The agricultural sector, especially in regions such as the Midwest, suffered from Chinese countermeasures, which in turn had a significant impact on the political situation in the country. The presidential election, which was in full swing, became an arena for discussion of trade policy and China's retaliatory measures. The US was faced with a difficult choice: to continue its aggressive policy or to seek a compromise that could bring the economy back on track. When China decided to impose retaliatory tariffs on American goods, the economic impact was much greater than the US could have imagined. In response to the high tariffs imposed by Donald Trump's administration, China did not simply expand its measures, it made them strategically targeted to inflict maximum damage on the US economy. The trade war quickly escalated from a routine exchange of tariffs to a long-term and serious conflict, the consequences of which affected not only large corporations, but also the daily lives of American citizens.
Those were quickly followed by reciprocal tariffs on every U.S. trade partner and very high sectoral tariffs applied globally on strategic industries, including steel, aluminum, autos, and copper.
The main blow fell on sectors that traditionally depended on Chinese imports. China immediately began to raise tariffs on agricultural products, metals, electronics, and other goods that make up a significant part of trade between the countries. Key industries such as the automotive industry, consumer electronics manufacturing, and even agriculture were particularly affected. Farmers in the US were forced to cut production and look for new markets, as China began to buy agricultural products on a massive scale from South America and Africa. Even Russian farmers took advantage of the situation by starting to supply grain and soybeans, which further undermined the position of American producers. But agriculture was not the only sector to feel the impact of Chinese tariffs. American automakers, already struggling with high production costs, found themselves facing a double whammy. On the one hand, higher tariffs on Chinese parts and components, and on the other, lower demand for cars amid economic instability. China, in turn, has implemented measures aimed not only at tariffs, but also at so-called intellectual countermeasures, demanding the protection of Chinese interests in the field of high technology and intellectual property. For example, Chinese companies have begun to cancel large orders for high-tech equipment manufactured in the United States. In particular, this has affected companies operating in the communications and semiconductor manufacturing sectors.
In a positive and very important development earlier this month, just a few weeks ago, the United States reaffirmed a core commitment to our free trade agreement, CUSMA, by reinforcing that those Canadian exports to the United States that are compliant with that agreement, that are compliant with CUSMA, will not be subject to U.S. IEEPA tariffs.
At the same time, Chinese tariffs have begun to put pressure on products that have become symbols of American cultural superiority, brands representing the American lifestyle and products. For example, within a few months of the introduction of the new tariffs, the Chinese began to reduce their purchases of American food products, such as popular brands of chips, sauces, and soft drinks, as well as cosmetics and household goods. One of the most high-profile stories was the mass suspension of sales by a well-known American cosmetics company in China, which caused a drop in shares and major partners dependent on the Chinese market. Against the backdrop of these events, mass layoffs began at a number of major American brands, leading to rising unemployment, especially in industrial and high-tech cities. While the American economy was struggling with this, a powerful economic crisis began within the country itself. Small and medium-sized companies, which by their nature did not have the resources to survive in such uncertain conditions, began to close en masse. Manufacturers that depended on cheap Chinese components were particularly hard hit. Entrepreneurs in the technology and consumer electronics sectors suffered catastrophic losses. Some companies were unable to adapt to the new conditions at all and closed down, unable to find alternative suppliers. Over time, China's measures began to affect larger corporations as well, which, despite their power, found themselves in a situation where their production chains began to break down.
Economic force, because Canada and the United States, that would really be something. So I think Canada is going to be a very serious contender to be our 51st state.
However, the most dangerous aspect of all this was the economic effect, which was soon felt by American consumers. The rise in prices for imported goods, before it became noticeable to the average consumer, led to inflation that turned out to be much higher than the US Federal Reserve's forecast. Americans began to face rising prices for the most basic goods, from clothing to electronics. This situation was exacerbated by increases in the cost of gasoline and utilities, which also became more expensive due to tariff measures and the consequences of economic chaos. Very soon, American analysts began to talk about Trump becoming the first president in the country's history whose administration led to such a sudden decline in the standard of living in the US. American businesses were forced to look for alternative sources for purchasing goods, which led to logistics costs, price increases, and even shortages of goods in warehouses. In turn, Chinese companies began to increase their presence in Europe and South America, securing new markets for themselves, while the US was unable to establish its own supply channels. China did everything possible to compensate for the losses from the reduction in trade with America, and it was extremely successful in this. Chinese companies, having taken over American market shares in other countries, began to strengthen their positions, which created even more threats for the US.
And to these ends, the United States has announced a series of trade actions. Those began near the start of this year with the so-called IEEPA tariffs against Canada and Mexico based on US concerns about the border and fentanyl trafficking.
At the same time, a real struggle for financial independence began to unfold, in which China increased its presence in international financial institutions, blocking Chinese investment in the American economy and trade with Russia, and the EU became China's strategy, the goal of which was not only to appropriate American financial flows, but also to create its own currency system independent of the US dollar. This, in turn, caused the US to react nervously, introducing restrictions and sanctions against Chinese companies operating in the financial and high-tech sectors, which only increased tensions. But China did not back down in response, and a new stage of economic confrontation began, involving not only the economies of the two countries but also global financial systems. Thus, the introduction of Chinese retaliatory tariffs was not simply an act of revenge, but part of a broader strategy aimed at weakening the US's position in the global economy. And no matter how hard the Americans tried to deal with this challenge, the reality was that each new step taken by China only exacerbated the problem, creating more serious economic turmoil and threatening not only internal stability of the US, but also the entire global economic order.
In fact, the average US tariff rate on the world has jumped from just over 2% at the end of last year to almost 16%, 8 times higher. 16% currently.
The consequences of the trade war between the US and China could have long-term and devastating effects on the global economy. What began as a dispute over trade tariffs quickly escalated into a deeper economic crisis that affected all sectors from agriculture to high technology. Within the US, the situation has become increasingly tense, and many have begun to realize that a trade war with China risks leading to a complete restructuring of the global economy, in which America could lose its former position. Economists began to warn that the US should prepare for the conflict to continue, as many factors influencing the outcome could lead to even greater losses. One of the most alarming aspects is that, due to Chinese countermeasures, the US could lose its economic position, on which the entire world trade system has been built for so long. China is actively expanding its influence, securing more advantageous positions in foreign markets and strengthening strategic partnerships with developing countries that were previously oriented toward trade with the US. In this way, China gains not only economic but also political advantages. In response to US sanctions and tariffs, the Chinese authorities have begun to develop new trade routes and alliances, including with Russia, Africa, and Latin America. These regions have become important buyers of Chinese products, which has significantly offset the losses from the reduction in trade with the US. Ultimately, this has led to significant losses for American companies, which can no longer compete in the same markets where China has significantly strengthened its position.
Really build on that relationship, and I think that's why the outcome this week was a positive one. Well, we know that no deal has been struck. We know that negotiations are going ahead in the right direction.
Meanwhile, the impact on the US domestic economy continued to grow. As tariffs became increasingly sensitive for businesses and consumers, new waves of unemployment began. Regions and industries that traditionally depended on Chinese imports or exports to China were particularly hard hit. Agriculture, automobiles, electronics, and consumer goods, all of these sectors suffered from Chinese retaliatory measures, sparking waves of protests among American farmers, manufacturers, and workers. The challenge for the US administration was not simply to find a compromise with China, but to minimize the damage to jobs and employment in these industries. The problem was that without the Chinese market, many American companies could not simply adapt quickly to the new conditions, and many simply did not have time to find new outlets for their product.
And Canada's been tough on the military because they have a very low military cost. They don't allow our banks. Did you know that? Canada does not allow banks to go in.
Instead of easing tensions, the trade war continued to escalate, leading to the destruction of entire industries and increasing economic problems. Many experts began to predict that the US risked losing its role as a global leader in technology and innovation. China, for its part, invested enormous resources in developing its own high-tech industry, and within a few years was not only producing goods at competitive prices, but also developing next-generation technologies. Chinese companies began to enter markets such as 5G, artificial intelligence, and robotics, while the US began to face problems in this area. Problems with importing key components, such as rare earth metals and microelectronics made in China, hampered the development of the American industry, which became another cause for concern. Experts warned that in the future, the US could face a shortage of critical electronics and components, making it dependent on China even in the high-tech sector.